back to Sunday Seminary Online. I'm Brennan and we are continuing our study of the prophets of the Exile. That is Jeremiah, and then Ezekiel, and then 2nd Isaiah. We talked the last couple of weeks about the kind of context of ancient Israel and of the exile itself. Last week we talked about the history leading up to the exile. And this week we're going to jump into the book of Jeremiah. I'm going to start with an introduction to the book of Jeremiah, a little bit of an overview of it, and then we'll look in particular to the call of Jeremiah. We're going to focus on Jeremiah chapter 1. I'll mention a bit of chapter 2 and chapter 3. But then next week, the week after this, we will look at the foe from the north, chapters 4 through 10 of Jeremiah. So we're going to kind of move through in a way. So we'll start with just remind you briefly, we're talking about the 6th century BC. Here's a little historical overview from the 8th to the 6th centuries. This is when Assyria becomes a dominant power and ends up destroying the northern kingdom in 722. And then Babylon becomes the major dominant power in Mesopotamia and then pushes into the same areas that Assyria was invading in basically Syria, Palestine, kind of the coastal region, which includes Judah. And then in 612, Babylon takes over the Assyrian Empire and continues to push south into Judah. And as we remember, there were 3 different deportations. The destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple takes place in 587 or 586, depending on how you date it. But there are 3 deportations. Ezekiel is taken in the first deportation. The second deportation after the destruction of Jerusalem is when the exiles, as we think of them more broadly, like the kind of the largest probably deportation occurs. There is a breakdown of order in Judah, in the kind of conquered province of the Babylonian province of Judah, when Gedaliah, the Babylonian appointed governor, is assassinated. There's a revolt. Babylon comes back. There's more destruction and displacement and deportations. This is also when a lot of Judahites end up fleeing to places like Egypt. This is when Jeremiah is taken against his will to Egypt into the diaspora, or the spreading abroad of the Jewish people. So Jeremiah basically lives through this time of crisis, and really we can say that the book of Jeremiah is trying to help people live through the crisis. I mean, a lot of the book of Jeremiah is actually like positioned as if it was written before the exile, but we can sort of tell that a lot of it was at least put together into book form after the exile, in part because of the kind of traumatic structure of the book. The book itself is hard to read. If you just sit down and read the book of Jeremiah, especially chapters 4 through 10, it's almost fractured as a book. Part of this is this response to these huge crises of the day. Kathleen O'Connor, a wonderful scholar who was at Columbia Theological Seminary for a long time, one of my predecessors where I teach, she's written a really beautiful book about Jeremiah that I recommend so much. I mean, a lot of what I tell you, I'll just go ahead and say this in advance. She's written a few articles too on Jeremiah that are beautiful, but she's written so much now, not just about Jeremiah, but also about Lamentations, about the book of Genesis. Now she's got commentaries coming out that takes seriously this idea that a lot of biblical literature was written in the wake of and in response to traumas, different kinds of traumas, and a lot of it is the trauma of exile. So the book of Genesis has lots of different materials in it that date to lots of different times. Somebody kind of compiled the information that became the book of Genesis, but we think that compilation process happened sometime around the time of the exile, or at least it begins. There's this kind of weaving of these stories together, and the editing together of a book of Genesis begins sometime around the exile in response to this trauma of displacement. That is, you start to write down these stories and edit them together when you think that they are endangered. So this kind of the trauma of losing one's entire frame of life, like your theology, the city that you think God has promised to you that's going to stand in perpetuity, the royal lineage that you think is going to stay in perpetuity. These things knit together the lives of people who lived in Jerusalem and in the environs in Judah. They believed, right, that God was with them in the temple. So when the temple's gone, when the royal lineage of David is destroyed, when the city itself is a smoking heap of rubble, and the people have been displaced to another place, right, the promised land that they were promised, that was given to them, is now gone, right? They've been taken, at least a lot of them have been taken somewhere else. This is a traumatic experience. Now, a lot of us, too, have been living through traumatic experiences. Death is pervasive in the United States and around the world right now. We're dealing with a pandemic. We are dealing with a displacement from spaces that we are used to, like our churches or like schools or like workplaces or our family spaces. A lot of us have been dealing with loneliness and isolation over the past year. A lot of us have dealt with displacement at our work and a lack of money, right? A lot of us have been dealing with housing instabilities and things like this. This has all been incredibly traumatic and breaks apart our idea of who we are sometimes, or what our nation is like. What can we hope in or hope for? What does the future look like to us? A lot of these things that give us a sense of purpose, a plan, an identity. We've lost a lot of these things, and not lost them for good, but they've been unmoored, right? That might be a way to explain how a lot of us feel over the past year. And it's important. It's not complaining. It's not whining. It's just important to realize that this is what we've been living through is, at least for many people, traumatic. It doesn't mean that we're blowing it out of proportion. It just means that we've gone through a particular kind of crisis. What trauma tends to do is robs people of language suitable to naming their experience. That is, that people feel like, how do I even describe what I'm going through right now? We've some of us have lived through experiences of acute traumas, like violence, abuse, things like that, accidents that have been traumatic. And sometimes when you live through something like that, you kind of realize I couldn't even put words to what I was feeling or what I had gone through. You kind of come up empty. What do I say in response to this? There's a sense of numbness, sometimes emotional numbness, that happens when people go through a traumatic experience. Sometimes there's a destroying of kind of underlying faith in God and the world and other people, in our nation, right? I mean, for many people, the last, month has been pretty traumatic. And you saw the images of the Capitol being destroyed. I mean, a lot of people felt like 9/11, right? Kind of brought a kind of violence and instability so close to home that shook their way of thinking about the world or the things that they kind of assumed about the world. We can get into the weeds about what that means, but just to say that this COVID-19 and the many traumas of the last year, they have led a lot of people to ask questions, right? What does this mean? Is God with us, right? Does the world work together? What are other people going to do when the chips are down, right? And there's oftentimes a damage that does to a sense of community. Do other people love me? Do they accept me? Do they have my back? Are we working together as a team? And so on. These are all things that are kind of thrown into the air when a community goes through trauma, but also when an individual goes through trauma. And we have to realize those are two different things. That some people are managing personal traumas that some of us haven't gone through, like the loss of loved ones, and so on. All to say that I think it's easy to kind of say, well, I didn't go through any of that. Sorry, you did. We have all been living through an intense time of displacement, and it's difficult. I mean, not all of us are getting up every morning and crying, but some of us are. But all of us, I think, are going through a time where we've been stretched in terms of our expectations for the future, at the very least, and our sense of community in the present. And with that, we can, I think, learn something from the way that Jeremiah goes about trying to talk about this situation. One of the ways Kathleen O'Connor talks about this in her literature on Jeremiah, but there's a larger field of studies, trauma studies, that do talk about how do people actually recover from trauma. Well, it's a stage, right? It's a process that people go through. We are all going to have to go through a process. I don't care if you think you're the toughest person in the world. We're all going to have to go through a process of recovering from what we've been going through over the past year. We went through a crazy pandemic. You can see this kind of thing, this recovery from trauma. You can see this in people who are the toughest people in the world, right? The generation that lived through World War I, right? The fighting in the trenches and so on. And it took them about 10 years to start dealing with it. And then artistically, it started to kind of flow out of their writing and art and poetry and so on, right? That is to say that there's this kind of need to express and to talk about what happened happened. And that's part of that's just naming the experience. What happened? A lot of times it's confusing what actually happened. So naming the experience, but also without re-traumatizing oneself. So like sometimes you have to wait a little bit, or sometimes you have to kind of come up with a way of talking about this thing. In the book of Jeremiah, there are several different layers of how Jeremiah talks about the exile, the destruction of Jerusalem. And there's quite some time, and we'll see chapters 4 through 10, Jeremiah doesn't really want to talk about Babylon. He talks about the foe from the north. He comes up with another name for the people who destroyed Jerusalem, and he uses that name exclusively. There's a sense of trying to talk about something without bringing up too much of it. There's also a sense of interpreting and reframing the trauma in the context of a larger narrative. That is to say, what happens a lot of times when we go through a traumatic experience is that our world seems to collapse or fall in on itself, or certain things seem to kind of, like our narrative that we tell ourselves about our life, about our community, about the world, the history, the plan that God has for us, all that seems to kind of crack and break apart. And so we don't just tell ourselves the old story over and over again. Something happened, right? Israel, the Judahites, the people who lived in Judah, the people who lived in Jerusalem, they know that Jerusalem fell. They know that it got destroyed. You can't just go back and say, oh no, the old story was true. God said Jerusalem would never fall. It'll never fall. No, everyone lived through it. They all know it. You have to come up with a new story, a new way to think about the trauma and to deal with it. And you might have to reconstruct a different narrative, a new story about who we are, where we came from, where we're going, what role God has to play in all of this. And to the extent that there was something that came out of the exile, that there was any faith that came out of it at all. That is, there were a lot of temptations for people to abandon faith in Yahweh. If you watched the exile happen, you might think Yahweh was a small god, God who lost to a larger god. Marduk, the god of Babylon, beat Yahweh. You should just worship Marduk then. Why have faith in Yahweh, right, anymore? You might be tempted to think that way. You might be tempted to think, well, clearly God doesn't have a plan, or God doesn't love us, or God won't take us back, right? To the extent that there was a faith that existed after the time of the exile, it was because there were particular people, specifically the prophets, who articulated new ways to understand themselves, new ways to understand God, new ways to understand the story. You might be smelling what I'm stepping in here, right? In terms of the what we're living through now, I do think there needs to be ways to not just say the old things again and again, right? The church is going through a period of transformation. The world is going through a period of transformation right now. What do we say to that? If we just continue to say the old story as if, and say the old things we've always been saying as if nothing ever changed, then we're not doing our job as theologians, as prophets, as people who have a message from God to give to this particular time. Now, I don't think that means we abandon the stories of the past or the prophets of the past, the theology of the past. I think it means, just like what Jeremiah does, Jeremiah doesn't go away from the laws of Moses or go away from the message of Moses. Instead, he goes back to the laws of Moses, back to the story of Moses, back to the laws that were handed down, back to the traditions that he had received, and he revisits them with this new perspective. And we'll see that throughout the book of Jeremiah. So I think that's what kind of giving us a model of what we can do too. Also, there's a sense that people who are speaking in the midst of trauma, out of trauma, trying to help people who have gone through trauma, name it, deal with it. There's a sense that using language to try to break through the emotional numbness to help people express their grief. This is a bit like what Kafka said, words can sometimes be ice axes to the frozen seas of our heart, right? Breaking it up and allowing us to express what we feel. Or as Shakespeare said, say what you feel, not what you ought to say. There's this kind of numbness that, things will get back to normal. It'll all be fine, whatever. Can we actually help each other express what we've gone through, how we feel? That's part of recovery from trauma. If you don't say these things, you just bottle them up and then you pretend you're okay. That happened to a lot of people after, say, World War II. That was not particularly healthy. It got expressed, that grief comes out. It comes out in different ways that aren't necessarily healthy. So in any event, you see this in Jeremiah and Ezekiel. They are sometimes uncomfortable books to read because they express grief. And we've been taught, that is, modern Americans have often been taught, don't express your grief, just express your optimism and your joy. Just kind of shove your grief down, right? But that there's a problem to that, right? That ends up coming out in unhelpful ways. And then lastly, part of recovery from trauma, at least as the prophets tell us about it, is that we can, how do we think about re-envisioning God? How do we think, God is so big, God is so awesome, God is so glorious that there's no real word we can use to describe God. Words are small things, they're human things, right? Our brains are tiny. God is much bigger than our brains. God is much bigger than our expressions, our emotions, our concepts, right? So whenever we use words to describe God, they're going to limit God in some way. And in the same way that, like, I could tell a story about someone that kind of depicts them in a certain way, it's true, but also there's a very different way I could depict them. There's lots of different portraits of God that are all true. And which portraits we have of God and that we kind of continually kind of put up in front of our own faces will affect us, and it'll affect our relationship to God. God can be angry, but if we only think about God as an angry father or something, that'll really change the way that we relate to God. And it's true in a way. God is angry sometimes, and God is like a father. But if that's your only way of thinking about God, it's going to reduce your ability to, say, recover from a traumatic experience. So there are different ways of talking about God, about thinking about God that are true, but also that might kind of reveal parts of God's splendor and glory that we tend to minimize or ignore in our own language. And maybe some of those different ways of understanding God can help restore our relationship with God. It's a problem with us, not a problem with God. But sometimes it's a problem with how we see it. Just in the same way that if we have a fracture in a relationship with someone else, sometimes just thinking about them differently, or thinking about them in a new light, or seeing them do something that we haven't seen them do before might just reframe the way that we see them. And that might get rid of our stumbling block for how we try to think about that person, relate to that person, and try to rebuild a relationship with that person. So all to say that these are some of the bigger topics that we're going to talk about in the book of Jeremiah. And some of the confusing parts of Jeremiah. It's a non-linear book. It jumps around in time and space. It seems paradoxical or illogical sometimes. There's brutality imaged in it. There's war poems and things like this. Sometimes Jeremiah's passionate. Sometimes Jeremiah seems cold and detached. Some of the things that make this book seem so strange, and Ezekiel, if we think about it as a book that is about the living through and helps people live through these experiences of trauma, that might help us to really understand it better and help us to relate to it better in our own lives. So just to say that Jeremiah has lots of ways that Jeremiah goes about helping people to respond to these crises of trauma. Like, for example, Jeremiah provides words that help people understand what happened. The war poetry we see in chapters, say, 4 through 6. These images of brutality. I mean, part of this is to help people understand what they went through when they went through the exile and the destruction of Jerusalem, or enabling expressions of grief. Jeremiah himself cries and talks about it, and he laments. This is why it's assumed that by many throughout Christian and Jewish history that Jeremiah wrote Lamentations, which probably isn't true. That his Lamentations was probably written by someone else, but it doesn't say it was written by Jeremiah. But all to say it bears similarities because Jeremiah laments as well, and is very clear about that. And then God also in this book expresses grief. God cries in Jeremiah. God moans and laments what's happened to the people of Israel. We'll get to the kind of paradox of that in a moment. But also, Jeremiah helps people to reframe older teachings. The New Testament, or when Jesus says, testament means covenant. The word, New Testament, Old Testament that we use to talk about the Bible. A testament in kind of ancient English was a covenant you made with someone. Your last will and testament was a covenant that you made with people after you died that would be revealed, right? There's an agreement, a deal. So the New Testament. The New Testament is a term that comes from Jesus when he says in the Gospels, at the words of at the Last Supper, when he says the words of institution, he says this is the cup of the new covenant. He said, it can also be translated New Testament. So the new covenant that Jesus brings, right, is assumed to be something that's separate and apart from the Old Testament or the Old Covenant. But I'm here to tell you that when Jesus says this is the cup of the new covenant, he's quoting and referring to Jeremiah, who talks about the new covenant. That is to say, also Ezekiel talks about the new covenant. So all to say that the new covenant is actually found in the Old Testament or the Old Covenant. People talk about Jesus does away with Judaism or something. No, not at all. Jesus is fulfilling and living into something that Jeremiah was talking about many centuries before. And then you can find that in chapter 31 of Jeremiah. We'll talk about that. We'll have a whole session where we talk about that. Really amazing text. But then also Jeremiah voices lamentation. We can see Jeremiah's confessions. We'll have a whole session where we talk about those. There's some surprising stuff where Jeremiah gets really mad at God. But then also this idea that Jeremiah is going to help people build hope and have a new hope. You can't go back to the old hope. You have to be realistic about what happened, but also there has to be some sort of way to reframe where we're all going. So this is kind of a larger way of helping to think about how Jeremiah works. If we have those things in mind as we go through the book of Jeremiah, it'll help us to make sense of some of what seems strange. One of the other things that's strange about this book, just to say, is that there's two different ancient forms of this book. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the oldest form especially, that was translated in Egypt sometime around the year 200 BC. So before Jesus, there's the Septuagint, the Greek translation of Jeremiah, is 1/5 shorter than the Masoretic text, the ancient Hebrew text. It was assumed for a long time that the Greek translator was lazy. Turns out, though, that at the Dead Sea Scrolls, in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, is this Hebrew copy of Jeremiah that agrees with, at least looks like it agrees with, it's fragmentary, with the Septuagint. That is to say, the Septuagint wasn't a bad translator translating into Greek and cutting a bunch of stuff out. There's an ancient version of Jeremiah that was 20% shorter. What does this teach us? That teaches us that Jeremiah was a process. It was something that was built over a period of time, and there are certain versions of Jeremiah that included stuff that other versions didn't, and that was okay to ancient people. That is to say, the people who had the Dead Sea Scrolls were a community of very pious Jews, and they had both of these texts, both of these versions of Jeremiah. Some other time we'll get to kind of the larger implications of this for the Bible and so on. But just to say, it's just an important thing for us to know. I'm going to be working mainly from the Masoretic text, the longer text, which is probably more recent. Like it probably has additions that were put in there. When we get to chapter 36 of Jeremiah, we're going to talk a little bit about why is there some stuff that was added after Jeremiah died, and is that okay? And Jeremiah 36 tells us, yes, it's fine. That Baruch the scribe was part of the process of putting together this book, and that Baruch could add things to it, and that was perfectly fine. And other scribes could too. That is to say that when we hear the words of the prophet, it's not necessarily the words of that were spoken, centuries ago by that particular prophet. They were received by a community and shaped by the community and passed down by the community, which included scribes, people who wrote these things down and collected them and edited them. So just to keep that in mind, there are times where that will become important. So here's a quick overview of the book of Jeremiah and just the structure before we jump into chapters 1 through 3. Chapter 1 is the call narrative. Chapters 2 and 3 are a bit of an extension, kind of an overview of the book. Let's just get into this now. So this is how the book is structured as a whole. So usually the beginning of prophetic books in the Bible have some information about the prophets. Context, historical setting, who the prophet was speaking to, what kings the prophet was prophesying during their reign, in order to kind of situate the prophet's message, and sometimes a little bit of information about the prophet's background or social context. So we'll have a bit of that here. That's often called the superscription, the first little bit of the text. So if you're looking at Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 1, the words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, that bit there in verses 1 through 3, that's the superscription of the book of Jeremiah. And then in verse 4, begins an oracle of Jeremiah. So an oracle is what a message that God gave to a prophet, then a prophet then gives. So then you'll see that the verse 4 begins Jeremiah saying me and I, but verses 1 through 3 of chapter 1, that's somebody else writing about Jeremiah. That's a scribe, maybe Baruch or somebody else, who is giving us some of the context of Jeremiah. So, but then the rest of chapter 1, this is Jeremiah's call. A call narrative is important because prophets are called. Prophets, you don't nominate yourself to be a prophet. There's a suggestion that there were some kind of prophetic guilds that may have had kind of fathers and sons or mothers and daughters kind of born into the guild. But typically the prophets that are in the Bible are called by God. That is, they don't kind of earn their position. God chooses them to be the messenger. So they need to be called. So just like Moses in Exodus 3 is called, usually this involves a rejection. Remember, Moses says in Exodus 3, when God calls Moses at the burning bush, God says, I want you to go and tell Pharaoh to let my people go, right? And Moses then objects and says, no, I can't do this, right? And Moses says, I can't do this because I can't speak well, right? So then God says, well, Aaron will speak for you, but I'm going to give you the message that Aaron will then say. So that after the objection, then God gives something, kind of concedes something to the prophet, but then also reaffirms the call, the task that the prophet has been given. And then usually after that, there's some kind of a commission, right? So this is kind of a commissioning ceremony in a way, and it seems important in ancient Israelite history, at least the books that end up being a part of the Bible. It's important in that strain of ancient Israelite thought that prophets not think of themselves too highly. They think, I can't do this on my own. That's a good thing, right? It's kind of like, who wants to nominate themselves to be president, right? Don't pick that person. So that's the idea for prophets in ancient Israel. So we'll see that idea here, that there's a call narrative, that there's a rejection, and then God kind of overcomes the objection and reaffirms the call. We can also see that in Ezekiel. We'll talk about that later. But then also there's a call in the book of Isaiah in chapter 6. There's another call of Isaiah in chapter 40, where second Isaiah starts, and we'll talk about that later on in this semester. So we're going to come back to this idea of call narratives. But in any event, Jeremiah is called in chapter 1, and it echoes Moses' call. And his call is to preach judgment and repentance. So prophets receive oracles of judgment and oracles of salvation, and usually it's in that order. That salvation doesn't come out of the blue and kind of for no cost. That is, that salvation comes as a response to something like repentance, or that it comes in response to the consequences of judgment. That's just the way that prophecy works in the Bible, and it seems to be the way that the New Testament works as well, but we'll get to that another time. But anyway, so Jeremiah is called in chapter 1. Chapters 2 through 10 we can call the foe from the north. The call of Jeremiah kind of continues a bit into chapter 2 or 3. You can even say that they're kind of traces of this. But there's kind of an overview, or we might say it's kind of like when one of those old movies starts, like Sound of Music. They have an overture. There's a bit of an overture through chapter 3 that is a lot of the themes that you see pop up for the rest of the book of Jeremiah. You can find in those chapters. But chapter 1 is truly the call narrative. So chapters 2 through 10 is where Jeremiah is speaking to people who are about to encounter the armies of Babylon. This is Jeremiah telling people that judgment is coming for them. One of the main chapters in here is chapter 7, which we'll focus on next time, which is the temple sermon. This is where Jeremiah gives a sermon where he explains what it is exactly that God is upset about, and this focuses on judgment. So we'll talk a little bit next time about how to understand this part of the story. And then chapters 11 through 20 of the book of Jeremiah would be the next chunk. And this is often called the laments of Jeremiah. Jeremiah sometimes these are called the confessions of Jeremiah, but these is Jeremiah kind of breaking his heart open and telling God how he feels about all this, which is not good. That Jeremiah not only feels that this is an excessive burden placed on him, and he feels bad preaching this judgment to his neighbors, but also he feels like God has abandoned him in some ways, and so he's honest about that and tells God about that. And God responds honestly and encouragingly. So all to say that there's this is another important part of the book of Jeremiah, and we'll spend some time listening to these and thinking about how we might lament as well as we go through this book. And then chapters 21 through 25, Jeremiah gives oracles against the leaders, particularly the priests in the temple. We'll talk maybe a little bit in just a minute about why Jeremiah might not have liked the priests of the temple very much. But also the king. Jeremiah believes that God has chosen the Davidic king. But Jeremiah also believes that this doesn't put the king above judgment. That if the king behaves poorly and doesn't follow the law of Moses, that this is that God is going to get involved. If the king wants to be Pharaoh, God's going to treat the king like God treated Pharaoh. If the king, the Davidic king, wants to oppress the people, God is going to get involved eventually. And then Jeremiah runs up against the authorities. In chapters 26 through 28, we have stories of Jeremiah getting involved. Some of these even seem a bit comical at times, but they're also terrifying. But Jeremiah is basically on death row multiple times in the story because he's prophesying against the king, which is taken to be an offense, like a treason against the king. And then we have a major shift in chapter 29. We get these letters, this letter that Jeremiah writes to the exiles. If you know one verse in the book of Jeremiah, it's probably Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11, which we're going to put in context here because it's part of a letter that Jeremiah sends to the exiles in Babylon who will not return alive. At least almost all of them will not return alive to Jerusalem. So when God has plans for you to prosper you, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything's going to be the way that you want it to be. So the people who are leaving there want to come back to Jerusalem right away, but it's not going to happen in their lifetime. Nonetheless, God is going to be with them and protect them and give them a hope and a future somewhere where they don't want to be. So we're going to talk more about that as we go along. And then in chapters 30 through 33, we have the Book of Consolation. I'm going to move my face a little bit there. The Book of Consolation is books. It's not really a book by itself, but it's a series of chapters that try to give some hope. There's also a discussion of judgment, the judgment that has already come to these people. This is kind of after the fall of Jerusalem, and it's written to people who are in exile, but it's promising them a hope and a future. It's kind of fleshing out some of the promises we see in chapter 29. This is also where we see the new covenant come in, so we'll talk about that as we go on as well. Then chapters 34 through 45 are a bunch of stories about Jeremiah and Baruch the scribe. Chapter 36 is an important one here for me as a biblical scholar to kind of understand what biblical texts were in the ancient world and how scribes understood themselves and so on. But in any event, Jeremiah is presented here in a bunch of these stories as an ideal survivor. But then also these stories follow the remnants that are left behind in the land, people who go abroad in the diaspora, and people who are taken in exile. And it kind of discusses what happens and in the aftermath of the destruction. And then I'm going to put my face even further down here. Chapters 46 through 52 are the oracles against the nations, or the OAN. This is a part of every single prophetic book in the Bible, these oracles against the nations. God gives messages against foreign nations, usually about God sort of helping Israel in the face of these foreign nations. And then also there's an appendix from the Deuteronomistic history. That is, there's a story taken from 2 Kings about the destruction. It's edited a bit, but we'll get to that as well. There's several different kind of endings to the book of Jeremiah here. Chapter 45 and then chapter 51 and 52 all could serve as kind of endings to the book of Jeremiah. So it's a book that kind of ends again and again. There's a kind of a problem with ending in the book of Jeremiah, we might say, and we'll discuss that that final week before we move on to Ezekiel. So this is kind of the shape of the book as a whole. But for now, let's just talk a little bit about who Jeremiah is. Now, as I said, the kind of subject of the book as a whole is the survival of the people. Jeremiah is trying to help the people of Jerusalem and of Judah think through the ramifications of the exile, of the destruction of Jerusalem. He's trying to tell the people that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is not done with Jerusalem. God is not done with the people of the exile. The kingdom is not done. The place, the land is not done. The people are going to survive this disaster. And the survival of the disaster is the subject of everything in the book of Jeremiah. Every poem, every narrative, every sermon in the book relates to this disaster, announces it, explains it, or offers hope for it, for living through it in some way. So who is this guy Jeremiah? This, by the way, is a Rembrandt painting, a beautiful one of Jeremiah lamenting over the destruction of Jerusalem. The destruction's happening in the background up there, and Jeremiah is weeping. But we can see a little bit about who Jeremiah is, his context, where he lives, why he's in such a position. If we look at the superscription. So the superscription is in chapter 1 of Jeremiah, verses 1 through 3. And it starts, the words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were in Anatote in the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of King Josiah, son of Ammon of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. It also came in the days of King Jehoiakim, son of Josiah of Judah, and until the end of the 11th year of King Zedekiah, son of Josiah of Judah, until the captivity of Jerusalem in the 5th month. This is a fairly long superscription. Many of them are a lot shorter than this, but you can see it's giving you the years of kings' reigns and rules in order to try to kind of help you understand this. But there's 2 different kings mentioned here. The word of the Lord comes to Jeremiah in the days of King Josiah in the 13th year of his reign, and then also in King Jehoiakim. This is much later. In the end of the 11th year of King Zedekiah's reign until the captivity of Jerusalem in the 5th month. So perhaps Jeremiah has kind of 2 parts of his career, or perhaps the part of King Josiah in the 13th year, that might have been when Jeremiah was born, because we'll see that the call kind of happens in utero in a way. But then also there are other explanations of this. It does seem strange that Josiah does a lot of things that Jeremiah would have absolutely loved, and Jeremiah doesn't seem to talk about him very much. Jeremiah talks a lot about King Jehoiakim and King Jehoiachin, or Coniah or Jeconiah, and also King Zedekiah. So those other kings are mentioned quite a bit in Jeremiah. Josiah is not, even though Josiah should have been kind of the hero of Jeremiah. So one really important thing about Jeremiah is that he is of the priests who were in Anatote in the land of Benjamin in chapter 1, verse 1. He was a priest, but he's not a priest that is serving in Jerusalem at the temple, where you might expect him to be serving, especially because he's in Jerusalem for much of the story, and he yells at the temple and things like this. If he's a priest, shouldn't he love the temple? And shouldn't he be working there or something? Well, no, maybe not. He's a priest who's in Anatote, which is, as you can see here, a small village that is north of Jerusalem on the border of what would have been the northern kingdom of Israel, but would have been destroyed and would be just the Assyrian territory or province of Seminary at that point in time, basically Samaria, but without an Israelite king or administration. But in any event, so Jeremiah comes from this little town. Now, Anatote shows up one other particular place that has to do with priests, and that is in the book of Kings. In 1 Kings chapter 1, in fact, at the time that David is dying and Solomon is fighting with one of his brothers, Adonijah, to take over the throne. So there's a fight between Solomon, who is favored by David and favored by Bathsheba, obviously Solomon's mother, but also favored by the prophet Nathan. And they are also supported by the high priest Zadok. Now, David had 2 high priests, Zadok and then Abiathar. That was the other high priest. And the other high priest, Abiathar, supported, along with a group of other courtiers, supported Adonijah, Solomon's brother, to be the king. So Adonijah tries to seize the throne along with his courtiers that are helping him. And then if you look at 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 7, he conferred with Joab, who's the general, right? The priest Abiathar, they supported Adonijah, but Zadok, this other high priest, and the prophet Nathan, and then David's own warriors didn't side with Adonijah. They end up siding with Bathsheba and Nathan to support Solomon for the throne. So when Solomon comes to the throne, then he has to deal with this faction that fought against him to become king, right? So what does he do? Well, he banishes Abiathar and he banishes him. This is in 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 26. The king, now Solomon, said to the priest Abiathar, "Go to Anatote, to your estate, for you deserve death, but I'm not going to kill you for this. You revolted against David, who chose me. You revolted against me." But then verse 27, so Solomon banished Abiathar from being priest to the Lord, thus fulfilling the word of the Lord that he had spoken concerning the house of Eli and Shiloh. We'll get back to Shiloh later next week, because Jeremiah refers to it. But in any event, this is saying that Abiathar's family, he gets deposed from his high priesthood in Jerusalem and gets exiled to this town, Anatote. So now there's some priests in this little town, Anatote. So now if you flip back to Jeremiah, knowing that, right, you've got maybe some reason for Jeremiah to be so mad at the temple that he gives a whole sermon about how much he hates the temple in chapter 7. But also that he might be someone who had been receptive to this message to criticize the king and the priest. And it's not that Jeremiah thinks that the king and the priest are evil in toto, but it's that he's willing to criticize them. He's willing to stand up to them. And part of that might be his background, right? That he's got this chip on his shoulder that's long-lasting from long ago, right? He's from the priests who were in Anatote. And it's kind of reminding us of that in chapter 1, verse 1. But he prophesies all the way up until the captivity of Jerusalem. And then his prophetic career, in a way, ends. He's saved by his friends, taken into the diaspora in Egypt, and that's where his story ends. We don't know anything more about him after that point. So he ceases to work as a prophet after then. So that's all the information that we get from that superscription, but it's a lot, and it gives us a lot of flavor to him. He's got concerns for priestly matters, but it's not the same as the priests who work in the temple. Ezekiel is a priest. Well, he's in the line of priests, but who worked in the temple. So that is, Ezekiel is a priestly priest who is from the lineage of, I think, Zadok. I think Ezekiel was the priest who was in line to be the high priest, but he was too young to become the high priest. And when the exile happened, he was taken into exile in 597. And so we get someone who has a different perspective on Jerusalem, a different perspective on the temple. He's got a lot of criticisms to make, but they're different ones than Jeremiah makes. And I think their social context gives them different windows into what was happening in Jerusalem and makes them more open to different criticisms that God might have for Jerusalem and for the temple priesthood and for the kings. So all to say, Jeremiah's oracles really begin in verse 4 with this call of Jeremiah. This is a beautiful image by Mark Chagall. These are the words of Jeremiah. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying. Now you notice that shift from Jeremiah in the third person in verses 1 through 3 to verse 4. Now it's about me, right? So these are the words. This is the oracle of Jeremiah. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." We're going to see this come back again as a kind of part of the call of Jeremiah. It's interesting because he does have oracles against the nations, but other prophets have more oracles against the nations than he does. He's really a prophet to Israel, but we might say Isaiah is more of a prophet to the nations. It talks about them more. But all to say that Jeremiah does talk a lot about Babylon in particular. So that might be a part of that. But there's this notion that God knows Jeremiah when Jeremiah is an infant, and there's kind of a call, or Jeremiah's in utero, and there's this call of Jeremiah. That might be the reference to the 13th year of King Josiah. It might have been when Jeremiah was born. I don't know, but it's a possibility. But so God lets Jeremiah know at some point later, perhaps in the days of King Jehoiakim, that there's this, that God lets Jeremiah know, you've been called ever since you were born. And then Jeremiah's response is, Lord God, truly I do not know how to speak, for I am only a boy. Now, you might recall this. If you look at Exodus chapter 3, Moses says, I can't speak. I can't speak well, God. So God calls Moses, and Moses says, Now, God doesn't tell Moses, I knew you in the womb. God just tells Moses, hey, listen, you got a job to do, right? And Moses says, I can't speak. Well, God says to Jeremiah, I knew you in the womb when I called you a long time ago. And Jeremiah says, whoa, I can't speak. But then he ups the ante. He increases the rejection that Moses made. I can't speak because I'm only a boy. That word in Hebrew, na'ar, doesn't mean like a little boy, like a baby or something. something, it can mean a grown man, but it just means someone who's not kind of old enough to take on their own responsibility yet. He's not old enough to do this stuff yet. I'm a young man or something. Now, that's more than Moses complained, right? So Jeremiah, I'm too young to do this, right? And I can't speak. But then the Lord said to me, so God comes back at Jeremiah's, sort of humble request, right? Do not say I am only a lad or a young man or something like that, a boy, for you shall go to all whom I send you, and you shall speak whatever I command you. This is what a prophet does, right? A messenger. Do not be afraid of them. And this is the beginning of an oracle of salvation. Do not fear. Do not be afraid. You hear the prophets say this sometimes. Angels say this to people. This is an oracle message of salvation, that God will be with you, that God is here to help you, right? So God one-ups the call of Moses by saying, I'm gonna save you, right? And then, for I am with you to deliver you, says the Lord. Now, God didn't say this to Moses at the call at the burning bush. I'm going to be there with you. But so God is kind of increasing this call. Now, God being with Moses was a really important part of the language about Moses. So in the book of, in the Pentateuch, from Exodus all the way through to Deuteronomy, Moses is described as someone whom God is with. And this goes into the book of Joshua as well, that God says, I will be with you, Joshua, just like I was with Moses. So this is a catchphrase for God and Moses, is that God was with Moses. But that's not said in Exodus 3 exactly, but here God promises, I will be with you. So there's an even greater promise here than with Moses. Now, what's interesting here is that there's such a strong connection and such strong resonance with the story of Moses in Exodus 3 here, and there's strong resonance with Moses throughout. Jeremiah is depicted as the new Moses. This is important because in the book of Deuteronomy, God says, I will send another prophet after me. God through Moses says, I will send another prophet like Moses. And Jeremiah is being depicted as that prophet who's going to come after Moses, not like fulfilling it and doing away with it, but kind of living into that reality and then leaving the door open for another prophet to come later and fulfill that identity. But you can see here that this story connects a lot to the call narrative of Moses in Exodus 3. That idea that there's a dialogue between God and the prophet, that there's a commissioning of this prophet for a particular task or message, let my people go. But here you're going to command over the people, and you're going to deliver this message to the nations. But also that there's this kind of active preparation, and there's a resistance by the prophet, right? The preparation here is that God started to prepare and consecrate and make Jeremiah holy, even when Jeremiah was in the womb. There's resistance, right? Jeremiah says, I'm only a boy, I can't speak. But then there's a reassurance by God. The same pattern happens with Mary, by the way, in Luke chapter 2, which is why I would say that Mary follows in this tradition of biblical prophets. She's depicted as a prophet in Luke, and it fits with the same exact pattern. And even the do not fear, do not be afraid, right, in that way. So, this is an overture for the book too, and this kind of sets the book in context, and we can see this continues. The one of the phrases in the book that's repeated the most, God is going to give to Jeremiah right here. So in verse 9, then the Lord put out the divine hand and touched my mouth. We're going to see this also in Ezekiel, that God is going to kind of help the prophet's mouth or give the prophet something to say. Ezekiel eats the scroll and it was delicious. Isaiah gets a coal touched to his mouth that kind of purifies his mouth in chapter 6. And here in Jeremiah, God touches Jeremiah's mouth, and God says, now I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and over kingdoms, to pluck up and to pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. Now, this series of 6 verbs, pluck up, pull down, destroy, overthrow, build, and plant, repeats several times throughout the book, in chapter 18, verses 7 through 9, in chapter 19, verse 6, chapter 31, verse 28, chapter 42, verse 10, chapter 45, verse 4. So it repeats over and over again. And you can see in these, so this is the kind of the catchphrase for the book, or catch sentence for the book. But pluck up, I've appointed you to pluck up and pull down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. So Jeremiah's words are going to do these things, or enact them. Really, it's God's power that does these things, but Jeremiah's word begins the enacting of these different things. But you can see there's 6 verbs here. 4 of them are about knocking things down, and the last 2 are about building things back up. And you can see in a way that pluck up, pull down, destroy, and overthrow, that's kind of relating to chapters 1 through 25 of the book, which have to do with God saying God is going to take apart the kingdom of Judah because it's become so oppressive and horrific. And then in chapters 29 through 31, we get this hope, this shift towards the book of consolation, right, in the letter to the exiles, about building and planting. And those words, building and planting, are actually used in that part of the book quite a bit. So this is kind of a summary of the book of Jeremiah in a way. Again, we're going to get to what this means exactly in a little bit. But this is a summary of the prophetic message of Jeremiah in toto. So the word of the Lord came to me, verse 11, saying, Jeremiah, what do you see? And I said, well, I see a branch of almond trees. This is part of it's a sign, really, and it's kind of like a sign that it's a part of wordplay, which is important for the ancient prophets. God would often show signs that kind of meant something. We can see this in Amos as well, when God plays with words. In the book of Isaiah, this happens as well. But so God shows an almond branch, and then God says, well, you've seen it, sure. And I am watching over my word to perform it. This is a word play because the branch of an almond tree is the Hebrew word shaked, and the word for kind of watching over to perform it, watching over, that's shoked. So it's like a, God is playing a word game here, which is how God's prophecy often works in the Old Testament. So God is watching over, and the almond tree is a sign, because it sounds alike, is a sign of God watching over this word. And then the word of the Lord came to me a second time, verse 13, saying, what do you see? And I said, I see a boiling pot tilted away from the north. So Jeremiah sees this vision of a boiling pot. And this is different. This is not wordplay. This is more literal. Then God says, okay, well, out of the north, disaster shall break on all the inhabitants of the land. So why the north? To the north of Israel is Syria, and to the north of that is basically Turkey, and to the north of that is like Slavic states and Russia up there. So what exactly is God referring to here by the north? Well, God's referring to Babylon, which, if you look at a map, isn't north. It's really due east of Israel. But the Babylonians wouldn't have gone straight through the desert in order to get to Israel. They would have gone up the Euphrates River into what is today Turkey, and then they would have come down the seacoast from the direction of Syria, that is from the north. So this foe that's going to come at you from the north is like a boiling pot, right? Boiling oil. It's this thing you can't get away from. It's going to destroy and devastate the land. Disaster is coming, is what God is saying. Now, God tells the prophets these things so that the prophets can tell the people these things, so that the people can change, so that the people can do something different, so that they can change their ways, and that this disaster will not come. As we see, Jeremiah tells the people this message, and it comes nonetheless because the people don't listen, especially the people in power. We're going to see that in chapters 2 and 3. So God is telling Jeremiah this. Verse 15, for now I'm calling all the tribes of the kingdoms of the north. Again, this is Babylon, says the Lord. It's not said Babylon, and we'll see in chapters 4 through 10 also, it's not said Babylon's going to do this, and in part that's that traumatic response. The word Babylon isn't going to occur in this part of the book. It'll occur in later parts of the book after the destruction has happened. But for now, it's just the foe from the north. And they shall come, they shall set their thrones at the entrance of the gates of Jerusalem and against its surrounding walls and the cities of Judah, and I will utter my judgments against them and all their wickedness in forsaking me. They have made offerings to other gods and worshipped the work of their own hands. So something about idolatry is happening here. As I mentioned before, idolatry isn't primarily about praying to other gods or going to other worship services or walking into another temple or something. That's not the main point. The main point of idolatry and God's anger with it is that when the people change their way of life, so that they are conforming their way of life to other gods, that is the gods of places like Babylon, just like Pharaoh, right? The way of life of Pharaoh, creating a slave-based economy, trying to destroy the lives of foreigners, right? For the sake of because they're foreign, trying to take advantage of people and create an economy that's based on taking advantage of other people. Destroying others in order to take what's theirs, that kind of activity is idolatry. Yahweh has a very different way of life planned, right? Think of like Genesis 1, right? That all people are made in God's image, or Genesis 2, right? That this world is to be treated as a garden, and we have been given responsibility for it, along with the other people here, right? That we are to relate to other people in this way. Or in Genesis 12, when Abram and Sarah are told, hey, being in relation with me means that you're going to be a blessing to all of the other nations. Or in Exodus 19, where God says, if you want to be in covenant with me, in relationship with me, that means being a priestly nation, right? Mediating God's blessing to all of the nations of the earth. When that doesn't happen, when the kings and priests and so on turn the people who have power, significant power in Judah and in Israel, turn the nation into something like Pharaoh, that's idolatry. They might say they're worshiping Yahweh, but they're not. They're conforming their life to the ways of the many nations around them, which are based on greed and gain and taking advantage of other people. And God unbuilds those systems eventually after giving a lot of time, right, for people to change their ways. We'll talk a lot about this over the rest of the semester, but that's the basic idea of idolatry here. And then verse 17, but you gird up your loins. So God's talking to Jeremiah. Gird up your loins means get ready. Kind of tie up your garments so that you're ready to run and fight. Stand up and tell them everything that I command you. So people are going to fight him for this. People are going to fight you, but you need to stand up and tell them. Do not break down before them, or I will break you before them. So in other words, God says, I'll make you a deal, right? You stand up strong and say the words that I'm giving you, and I'll be with you. But they're going to fight you. And if you abandon me, I'll abandon you. Verse 18, and I, for my part, have made you today a fortified city, an iron pillar, a bronze wall against the whole land. They can't hurt you, even if they try, God says, against the kings of Judah, its princes, its priests, and the people of the land. I've made you strong against all of them. No one can take you down, but you need to trust me. And then verse 19, they will fight against you, but they shall not prevail against you, for I am with you, says the Lord, to deliver you. There's that I am with you, referring back to Moses, but also referring to what God said in chapter 1, verse 8, do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, says the Lord. So they're going to try to fight you. They're going to try to kill you because of what you're saying, because what Jeremiah is saying is treason. Jeremiah is saying the king and the high priests and so on, the people who have power, have become idolaters. They have conformed their way to worshiping another god. God is going to destroy this place if we don't change, and that's going to sound to their ears like treason, and they're going to try to kill you for it. And if you if you stand strong, they will not hurt you, I promise, God says. Now, we'll keep this in mind, because in 2 weeks, Jeremiah is going to tell God that God's a liar, and that God has abandoned him, and God is going to repeat some of this. So we're gonna get to that showdown in 2 weeks. So then God, in chapters 2 and 3, I'll give a short overview of some of this. But God begins to get upset with Israel and tell Jeremiah why it is that God has picked Jeremiah to give a message, primarily to the leaders. Jeremiah is not getting mad at kind of everyday common people as much as Jeremiah is getting mad at the kings, the priests, the people who have significant power in the country, and how they have conformed the country to something that has gone against God's wishes and the way that God has taught them to live. Verse 5, thus says the Lord, here's the message that Jeremiah has been given, the oracle. What wrong did your ancestors find with me that they went far from me? They went after worthless things. They became worthless themselves. They did not say, where is Yahweh who brought us up from the land of Egypt? Right? This going back to the land of Egypt, the time of Moses, this is really important. This is the touch phrase for all of the biblical prophets is the Exodus, that God saves those who have been oppressed. You forgot about that, is what God is saying here. When you entered the land, verse 7, I brought you to a good land, but you defiled this land, and you made my heritage an abomination. The priests did not say, where is Yahweh? Those who handle the law did not know me. The rulers transgressed against me. Notice, it's the priests, it's the ones who handle the law, it's the rulers, and then the prophets who prophesied by Baal. The leadership has gone astray, and God needs to remove them. And really, the people who lost the most in the time of the exile and the destruction of Jerusalem were the leaders. God unbuilt their power structures that they had built. So in verse 8, the priests did not say, where is Yahweh? That's their job. Where's Yahweh? Follow Yahweh, right? But they abandoned that. Those who handled the law did not know me. That is the religious law, like those people who taught, the Levites, who were supposed to teach people the law. They didn't follow. The rulers transgressed against me. That is the kings. The real word here in Hebrew is shepherds, which is an ancient, this goes all the way back to the earliest written documents. This goes back to Sumerian times, this metaphor of saying that the leaders are shepherds. But so the shepherds, really the rulers, transgressed against me. The prophets prophesied by Baal, and they went after things that do not profit. That is that they went after things that profited, all right. They tried, right? They tried to follow the prophet. How do kings profit? Well, they oppress people. How do the priests and the rulers of the law, readers of the law profit? Well, they oppress people and try to take the money, right? How do the prophets profit? They prophesy that Baal is going to make the rains come, right? And they capture the profit from that. But Baal and this system of kind of profiting off of creating this agribusiness structure, or this kind of oppressive governmental structure that went along with it to try to take from people, this is not going to actually lead to profit like the people in charge think it is going to. So therefore, once more, I accuse you, says the Lord. Accuse, this is like a controversy. This is really kind of a lawsuit. God's going to bring a lawsuit against the leaders. Now, why would God bring a lawsuit against them? Because they have a contract, the covenant. It's a contract. So with this contractual language, it's also understood to be a marriage, right? God is married to the people of Israel, or God has a contract with them. So God brings up lawsuits against them, or God says, you've abandoned me and gone after other gods, as if someone who has been unfaithful in a marriage, right? This marriage metaphor is important for the prophets because it's covenantal in nature. So God is going to get upset, right? And God says that they've, verse 13 in chapter 2, my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living water, right? Jesus didn't come up with that. Jeremiah talks about how Yahweh is the one of living water. That means like an ever-flowing stream, not a stream that dries up in the middle of the summertime, which is common in the ancient Near East, but like an ever-flowing stream, right? The fountain of living water, and dug out cisterns for themselves, cracked cisterns that can hold no water, right? So God is the one who provides life for people, but they've forgotten that. But take a look also, if you flip over to verse 26 of chapter 2, as a thief is shamed when caught, so the house of Israel shall be shamed, they, their kings, their officials, the house, right? That's like the house of Windsor or something, the house of Israel. That is the leadership. They, their kings, their officials, their priests, their prophets. That is the leadership, is the one who are being condemned here, who say to a tree, you are my father, and a stone, you gave me birth, right? This is a reference to some of the other cults that you might see in the ancient Near East. That is, say to a tree, you are my father. This kind of making it's like mocking other worship practices in the ancient world, but saying to gods and goddesses that are associated with trees and stones and other natural things that they're the rulers of the universe, right? This is about idolatry. They have turned their backs to me and not their faces. That is, the people have turned their backs to God in order to worship these other gods. And their time in trouble, they say, come and save us. So now the people are going to say, come and save us. But where are your gods that you made for yourself? Let them come if they can save you in your time of trouble. For you have known many gods, as you have towns, O Judah. So in other words, in the end, they're going to come back and say, oh, help us, God. But it's going to be shallow and empty. And it's only going to be a matter of last resort after they've already tried calling on all these other gods. We're going to come back to this next week when we talk about the temple sermon in Jeremiah and the many connections to the book of Deuteronomy in particular. So one more little bit here in verse 34. Also in your skirts is found the lifeblood of the innocent poor, though you did not catch them breaking in. So that is to say, there are innocent poor people that you have killed, leaders of Judah. Yet in spite of these things, you say, I am innocent. Surely his anger has turned from me. Oh, God's going to help us. God's going to save us because God loves us, right? Well, yes, you're special. Yes, God promised many things to the king of David. God, in the line of David, God promised many things to Jerusalem. But God's not going to save you from the life of the innocent poor when you take them, right? God's not going to look the other way just because you're special. You are special. Special as in God has given you a special job to fulfill, to be a kingdom of priests that mediate God's blessing to the peoples of the world. This is, in a way, God is trying to say, these are the things that you've done wrong. This becomes much more clear in chapter 7 as well. In chapter 3 as well, starts by saying, if a man divorces his wife and she goes from him, will he return to her? This marriage metaphor, this is about the covenant, that the people have abandoned Yahweh and the covenantal relationship that God has with Yahweh. And you can see there also are promises of salvation here. Like in chapter 3, verse 12, I will not be angry forever, God says. Like, I won't look on you in anger. I'm merciful, return. I'll be with you. Acknowledge your guilt, that you have rebelled against me, right? Just repent, turn. And then verse 15, I will give you shepherds, that is leaders after my own heart, who will feed you with knowledge and understanding after you've multiplied and increased in those days. So there is a promise to the future. We'll talk a little bit more about this chapter next time in chapter 4 as well. But there are these kind of promises, right, that God is going to return and give blessing to Israel and the nations. So like in chapter 4, verse 1, if you return, O Israel, says the Lord, if you return to me, if you remove your abominations from my presence, if you don't waver, if you swear, as Yahweh lives, in truth, in justice, in uprightness, that is good action, then the nations shall be blessed by Yahweh, and by Yahweh they shall boast. So Israel and the nations are going to love God. So in any event, this is just a kind of a taste of the book that is to come. But this is Jeremiah's message in short. The rest of the book, I'll flesh out some of these different claims and so on. Next time we'll take a look at the laments that we see in the kind of, beautiful but also troubling poetic descriptions of what happened in the exile and in the destruction of Jerusalem in chapters 4 through 10. And we'll take a closer look at that temple sermon where Jeremiah lays out very clearly what he's all about. So we'll get to those things next week. I know there's a lot. There's a lot here. The main takeaway, I would say, from a lot of this is that God is involved in the world, both destructuring oppressive systems and restructuring and rebuilding, to build and to plant new structures that are going to lead to the kind of life that God wants. And sometimes those things are tied up together, right? Sometimes things are being rebuilt and that need to be unbuilt later. It's a cycle that we live through in a way. Judgment, but also promise and restoration. The judgment is good. We're not going to get better unless we get challenged. And in that same way, sometimes these terrible destructions that happen are both tragedies and they're opportunities to rebuild. So that's some of the tension that we're going to live with in the book of Jeremiah. Okay, blessings on you all this week, and I look forward to talking to you all next week.